Thank you. Um, the story takes place in 1985 when the man who told it to me, a man named Alex DeWall, who some of you may know is one of the leading experts on Darfur, was in the region as a PhD student. And he met with this sheikh, who was a kind of a powerful and imposing man, but one that had been kind of beaten by age. He was nearly blind. He was bedridden. But he was still the head of this nomadic tribe. And he invited Alex into his tent. And Alex told him what he was doing, which was studying the way that people were reacting to the drought. And the sheikh had a reaction that was very strong. He said, listen, I've seen things I've never seen before. You know, sands are blowing over lands that people once farmed. When the rain does come, it washes away soil. But more importantly, it's the social order has been disrupted. And he sketched in the sand a chessboard as kind of an illustration of what DeWall later called the moral geography of the region, not the real geography, but the way that things kind of worked. And he said that in the dark squares, you had the farmers plotted doing their farms, and in the white squares, the nomads would pass through, kind of like chessboard bishops, interacting but not interfering. And the two groups were able to coexist. And all that was changing. The farmers that once hosted the nomads were now fencing off their lands. They were burning fields even if they weren't using them. And the sheikh was deeply shaken by this. And he basically, for him, it was the way that God had intended the world to work was no longer working. So that made a big impression on Alex. And when it happened, and I think it made an even bigger impression 20 years later, when he was, as we all were, or many of us were, looking at the conflict in Darfur in 2003 that had broken out. You had Arab militias, the Janjaweed, laying waste to the region. They were targeting the region's blacks. They were killing men, raping women. They were burning houses and just depopulating huge swaths of this area. And at their head was another tall, commanding figure. This was a conflict that the U.S. State Department would soon call genocide, and he was number 3 on their lists of suspected war criminals. Well, when DeWall saw this man, he recognized the name and he recognized the man, and his name was Musa Hilal, and he was the sheikh's son. And the reason I start the story with this book is because for me it's a kind of a powerful evocation between the father and the son, the father that sees the degradation and then the worries about it, and then the son that kind of carries out his father's worries.
When it shows how clearly climatic conditions can produce hostile action and lead to conflict. Now, even on that trip with Mr. Bond, who for the first time was focusing on climate change and climatic conditions as a cause for what at that point it still is on maybe the world's worst conflict, there were people who were saying, isn't he exaggerating? Isn't he going too far? Don't we run the risk, if we focus on this aspect of it, of not focusing enough on the atrocities and the people who committed those atrocities? How do you answer that question?
Right. As well as his statements in the article that I wrote got quite a lot of pushback, I think, from people who were worried that blaming climate change meant not blaming Khartoum, or blaming climate change meant not looking at some of the other causes. I thought about this quite a bit after writing the article and before writing the book. And the analogy I came up with is that if we think about climate change on a country or in a people and hunger in a person, if you have a person who's starving to death and he succumbs to tuberculosis, or he tries to steal some food and gets shot, well, you wouldn't say necessarily that he's died of hunger, but you would also not be right to look at the hunger as part of what caused his death.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking tonight across the street from the United Nations. A lot of the people in the audience are people with connection to the United Nations. The United Nations spends a lot of time thinking about these kinds of conflicts, how to prevent them. And there's a lot of focus these days on what we call early warning, on prevention, on how do we see the signs ahead of time of this sort of thing happening. You talk about this a bit in the book. How, if somebody wants to ward off the effects of what, after all, is climactic and hard to control, What should they be looking for? What kinds of places should they have their eye on where climate change could come in and turn a terrible situation into a real conflict?
Sure. There's a Canadian academic named Thomas Homer Dixon who's been studying the links between environmental issues and conflict for a long time. So I'm indebted to him for some of this. But he basically the short answer is that the places that are somewhat more vulnerable for a variety of reasons, places that are overpopulated, where there's lots of competition over scarce resources, where maybe education levels are limited, or where the governments are corrupt, are going to be the places that are going to be less able to withstand. If you think of climate change as kind of putting pressure on a country that's more robust is going to be able to shrug that off, or at least deal with it, or cope with it in a way that doesn't lead to collapse. But a country that's already torn by issues, like for instance Darfur, that's been already torn by this issue of drought, when you add that, or competition over land, when you add that climate change, all of a sudden it's no longer able to bear the burden, and it can snap.
What happens in rich countries versus poor countries? You have a good example in the book of two low-lying nations, the Netherlands
Right.
and Bangladesh, both threatened by rising sea levels. How does the Netherlands cope, and what happens in Bangladesh when the waters rise?
Sure. What I was trying to do with that example is show how both of them face this common problem, that their lands are either at or slightly above or below sea level. But the Dutch have centuries of experience in building dikes and have the capital to keep on doing it. There's even houses they've built now that are built on pontoons, and they're made so that when the water floods, they actually rise up, like become houseboats, and then when it recedes, it goes back down. And the Dutch have the capital and the ability to do that. Bangladesh, however, which is I think somehow even more threatened by climate change than the Netherlands, they don't have the capital for that. So all they can do, they don't have the ability to adapt. All they can really do is prepare to flee.
To flee. And when they flee, where do they go? I guess what I'm getting at is it a threat to other countries in the same region? I mean, will they end up in Pakistan or China or someplace like that?
Sure. In the book, I traveled to Assam, which is if you think of India, I used to think of it as kind of a triangle shaped, but it actually has an arm that kind of reaches over, I guess this way, reaches over Bangladesh, and it's that area there, which is an area that already has many insurgencies, and it's been absolutely over the last 20 or 30 years has experienced a lot of immigration from Bangladesh, and it's causing huge amounts of political tension. Some people say that the insurgencies in Assam were caused by issues with migration, and so if those issues increase, we're going to keep on seeing more tensions in the areas where these people arrive.
What about another area that you mentioned in the book, and I wanted to ask you just to explain why climate change has such an effect on it, is Kashmir, one of the longest running conflicts, perplexing conflicts, insoluble conflicts in the world. Is climate change an issue there too?
Well, it's probably not yet, but what I was trying to do with Kashmir I looked at Darfur, and that was kind of where I first started looking at climate change, and I wanted to kind of see if there's another part of the world where climate change could also be, we could predict it would have an effect that might be similar. And so I looked at Kashmir, and the issue there is the conflict in Kashmir is usually thought of as between, it was one of over identity, where you have whether Kashmir belongs to Muslim Pakistan or if it's part of greater secular India. But there's another underlying issue, and that's water. Pakistan relies on the waters that flow through Kashmir for about 90% of its agricultural irrigation. And that water right now, it falls in the wintertime, and it lands in the glaciers, and it freezes. And then in the summertime, as the temperatures warm up, it melts and flows into Pakistan in time for the harvest. By 2035, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the glaciers are supposed to not be there anymore. And already, according to people in Kashmir, you're starting to see more runoff in the winter, floods in the winter, and less in the summer, or decreasing amounts in the summer. And so the problem is all of a sudden these rivers are going to be flowing at the wrong time. They're going to be flowing in the winter when it's not needed. Now, India and Pakistan have a treaty that divides the rivers, and it's lasted 50 years. It's lasted through 4 wars. It's often talked about as like an example of how scarcity leads to cooperation rather than conflict. But what I look at in the book, and what I think is true, is that treaty depends on the status quo. It depends on the rivers flowing in the right time, because if the rivers are no longer flowing, you have to do something about it.